He overheard me mocking him with my friends. When I came back home, there were divorce papers. I lost him. I lost the man I love. And now all I'm stuck with are regrets and perhaps the hope that maybe somehow, in some way, he'd miraculously come back to me. That's why I'm here on this app telling my story. So maybe someone out there might have advice that would work to get my man back. Hello, Reddit. My name is Martha. For privacy's sake, all the names will be made up, but the story definitely isn't. And I'm 28 years old. I am married, still clinging to hope that I still would be, because I haven't signed the papers yet, to Ricky. Our marriage is almost 4 years old now, and we have no kids yet. Not that I couldn't get pregnant, I just chose not to because I was a career woman, and now I do regret that decision so much. Before I met Ricky, my parents were very rich. I mean, very, very wealthy. They owned multinational companies and dealt with various businesses. They weren't exactly involved in just one line of business, hence the money came from different sources. My father was a very smart man, and quite intelligent too. Stories about him that my mother would tell me would keep me up at night, and have me studying so hard so I could take over his company someday. He was very talented, and was evidently a jack of all trades. He was originally from a poor background, and despite being such a brilliant mind, he had to drop out of high school because his poor mother couldn't afford it, and his father was a helpless drunk who wouldn't do anything but drink and embarrass himself. My father started working for a rich old man as his gardener and houseboy at the age of 15, and would gather all the business newspapers the rich man threw away after reading and read them. He would always say he learned business from the news, and because of that, he was always reading the news. Therefore, he was widely knowledgeable about nearly anything that had to do with business. When the rich old man died, he left one of his lands to my father, because, according to him, he was a promising young man. My father started as a farmer, and then grew his farm so big that he began to expand and invest in other businesses alongside. That brought about his wealth. Sadly, he died from lung cancer when he was just 48, and when I was just 10 years old. And I don't want to bore you with stories of how my dad became wealthy, but I wanted you guys to understand my drive. I wanted to live up to my father's legacy. I wanted to increase and build an empire on what he had already built. I was so focused, and I couldn't let anything get me distracted, so that meant no friends or playmates or boyfriends throughout my school days. Even as a child after my father died, I wasn't interested in anything other than my books. My mother tried to get me to have fun by throwing birthday parties for me and inviting every kid around my age to them, but I wasn't interested. I would, when she wasn't looking, sneak upstairs and continue with my books. She would even organize sleepovers for me sometimes and ask me to invite some of my friends over, but I wouldn't. Not that I wouldn't, but I couldn't because the first sleepover my mom forced me to have was a disaster. They wanted to talk about boys, fashion, the teachers they hated from school, and everything else, and I wanted to talk about business. They didn't understand that, and after that they chose to avoid me like the plague. So I basically grew up with my head stuck in one book or another, so literally, socialization was one thing I lacked the most. By the time I was done with my university education in business, I became the CEO of my father's company, and I was doing well with it. I traveled a lot to oversee the other companies around, and I was usually so busy I barely had time for anything else. I mean, no parties except the ones that brought me potential clients or investors, no friends hangouts because I barely had one. I was only mostly so tired that whenever I had the chance, if I had the chance, I just slept. I was driven like my father was, and hence I was very successful. In fact, I started buying out companies and merging them with mine, meaning when companies go bankrupt or are in dire need of money to support their originally thriving business, I loan them enough money to get rid of their problems, and in exchange, I become a major shareholder and eventually buy them out. That was how I met Ricky, my husband. He was a technician in one of the companies I bought out. They gave me a lot of issues before the owner eventually decided to take the money and sell. When I found out that Ricky was the one who was against the owner selling out, I was interested because he held out long enough, and the owner, when he eventually sold to me, did so under the condition that the workers working there were retained. I invited Ricky over to my office after finding out he was the one who proposed that idea to the owner, and when he came over and started to talk about all his ideas for the company, I was so pleased that I employed him to work directly in the headquarters instead of the sub-companies. He had this aura that drew me to him, and he was a very funny person to be around. Till now, I do not know of any other person who has made me laugh as much as Ricky did. Since Ricky reported directly to me, it was easy for me to see him and hear him speak, and I did take advantage of that opportunity. I would purposely invite him to my office under the pretense of finding out about how his projects were coming along, just to see the sparkle in his eyes whenever he spoke about his projects, or the way his dimple deepened and he smacked his fingers whenever he got a new idea. I knew I was attracted to him, and I didn't understand why. Ricky wasn't exactly handsome at first glance. He was fine, quite all right, but he wasn't exactly top 5 handsome, and it baffled me. I had always thought I would be attracted to any guy by his physique and also fashion sense, but Ricky wasn't exactly one of those. In fact, Ricky could wear 2 different colors of clothes and end up looking like someone who just took what he saw first, wore it, and dashed out of his house. One time, he had been speaking about his project as usual. I was only half listening, and I blurted out loud that his fashion sense was clearly not working. I had turned red and wanted to mutter an apology since I realized my words had hurt him, but I couldn't because of my pride. I was the boss, and he was my employee. I felt I could say whatever I damn well pleased. Ricky obviously took it seriously, as the next week his dress changed and he looked smart and clean with a new haircut different from his usual styles. I was pleased. I was falling very much in love with him, and my feelings scared me because I never had a boyfriend, so I didn't know how to act or talk around him. But I guess love had a way of speaking for itself, especially because Ricky eventually noticed. Maybe I had made it obvious by snapping at Rachel, my personal assistant, who was flirting with Ricky right in front of me. Or the one time I had seen Ricky talking to a female employee and laughing with her like he had never done with me, and I had her fired. After that, I started becoming very irritable with Ricky, and he eventually confronted me about it. I asked him out. Yes, you read right. I asked him out on a date, which I eventually ended up ruining by not showing up. Not because I didn't want to, but because at first I had been excited he agreed to a date, and then when I was faced with choices of clothes, I realized I had nothing casual to wear. Most of my clothes were formal, and I couldn't dress formally to a date, according to the dating advice site I saw online. I went shopping, and with the help of the shop assistant, I was able to choose a casual dress, and I felt excited again. But then I panicked. I didn't know what they did on dates. Yes, I did read a lot of online articles on what to do on a date, but I just knew instinctively that I couldn't do all that with Ricky and earn brownie points, so I was just devastated that day and ended up not going at all rather than going and embarrassing myself. Ricky was very mad at me, and for the next couple of days after the whole date thing, whenever he came to report, he was brief and left as quickly as he could. I knew I had to swallow my pride and apologize, so I did, and lied about having a work emergency that I couldn't get away from. Ricky being Ricky was understanding, and he let it go, and this time he was the one who planned the next date. This time I showed up and had so much fun. From then on, we went on many other dates, and I was surprised at how many good restaurants were around that weren't 5 stars. I loved hanging out with Ricky. He was just the sweetest and most caring person. I was amazed that despite him having so little compared to my own wealthy status, he still bought me little gifts and paid for every one of our dates. Whenever I offered to pay or take our hangouts to luxurious places, he would refuse and tell me that there was more fun in places you didn't have to spend much. It was relaxing having someone take responsibility for me instead of relying on me for something. I was happy with him, and when he eventually asked me out, I said yes without hesitation. We dated for a year, and I was so happy because Ricky was my first boyfriend, first kiss, and also first sexually, and he made every experience worth the wait and certainly memorable. I loved being with him so much, and he obviously adored me too. On our 1-year anniversary, Ricky had purposely taken me to a top-star restaurant for the first time after we started dating. I was honestly surprised because he never was one to fancy stuff like that. In fact, he wore a suit for our dinner and looked pretty nervous. I had been wondering what was going on, but that turned into a surprise when the first course brought to us was a ring on a plate and a "Will you marry me" design in front of it. I was so happy and said yes. The ring was nothing like what I would even pick, even as a third choice, but I was just happy Ricky loved me enough to marry me, so the ring didn't even matter at that point. The problem started when I introduced my fiancé to my mom and our family. By our family, I mean my mom's sisters and her snobbish and spoiled children who lived with my mom after Dad died. The more reason I usually refused to go home was because of them. They were demeaning and always seemed to find something wrong with whatever I did, despite the fact that they were living on my money. Once a week, they usually had this family gathering thing that they did. My mom was obviously bored with life and started partying and always trying to keep busy. I guess that was her way of dealing with the grief of losing Dad. So I brought Ricky to one of those gatherings to finally introduce him to the family, and well, let's just say things didn't exactly go as planned. My mom's surprised that I was not too stuck in work to date someone changed to horror when she asked him about work, and he told her he worked with me. So did my mom's sisters and their kids. I left the party feeling pretty hurt and angry on Ricky's behalf. Ricky was the one who calmed me down and told me it was nothing as he had expected such reactions and prepared for them. We started planning our wedding, and my mom refused to have anything to do with it and started disturbing me to break things off with Ricky until I threatened to leave her out of my life forever if she didn't accept my choice. My lawyers were another problem. They didn't believe that Ricky was marrying me for all the right reasons and forced a prenuptial agreement on us. Ricky did sign to prove he wasn't marrying me because of my money. Ricky agreed with everything they did except one, which was hosting a big wedding for us. He wanted to spend all the money and only allowed me to get my wedding dress myself because, as he said, it was my day as much as it was his. The wedding was quite small, and the only people in attendance were our families. My family consisted, of course, of my mom and her siblings and their kids, and Ricky's family consisted of his mother, his 2 brothers, and their last-born sister. Ricky's mother, Morgan, was the most amazing woman, and I just loved the tight-knit family she created for her kids, with her husband long gone before she even gave birth to Marissa, her last child. They told each other everything and were always looking out for each other, and I envied their relationship. So we got married, and I was the happiest. I never thought something as simple as getting married could make me so satisfied and fulfilled until it actually did. Ricky didn't change. In fact, he was just always the sweetest to me despite my family's troubles. They were always trying to hurt him with their words at every chance they got, which was a lot, as my mom insisted we live with them. Ricky never complained to me, and all he did was work and make sure I was happy and satisfied all the time. 6 months after our wedding, Ricky told me about his decision to start up his own company and resign from mine. He gave me no choice as he refused any sort of payment or me giving him some money for capital. 2 years into our marriage, Ricky's startup company wasn't where it should be. He had ideas and the zeal to work, but investors weren't forthcoming, and he wouldn't accept my help with the management or with me investing in his company, saying he would handle it on his own. Despite his stubbornness, I understood that he wanted to prove to everyone, especially me, that he could do very well for himself without his wife's money, and for that, I was very proud of him, but still was concerned. But my mother, thinking that it was my money he used for starting up his own company, started taunting him at every chance she got, and every failed attempt of his to get an investor or a contract, after probably spending a lot of money, was another opportunity for her to talk down to him. The problem was I never defended him, not even once when she started nagging at him. I would just sweep the matter under the rug, and whenever we got back to our own side of the house, I would just mutter, "You know how she is. You'll get used to it." Ricky never complained to me, though, and would just smile and move on. One time, Ricky suggested we move out of the house to our own place, and I came up with different excuses about how the house was closer to work, and I needed to be there for Mom since she had no other child, and this and that. Ricky accepted my excuses and didn't bring it up again. In reality, I just didn't want to leave my comfortable space at all, the luxurious things and all, because I knew that if we moved, Ricky wouldn't want me paying for a house similar to mine, but probably a smaller and less comfortable house, and I didn't want that for myself. The second part of the problem started when I decided to invite Ricky's family over for a dinner party I put together to celebrate his birthday. The evening had started off great, and it was really nice. There was dancing, which I enjoyed so much because Ricky was such a good dancer and was always teaching me some steps, and I was happy. The night was going well, the food, the drinks, all available. But while dancing with Ricky, I noticed that my sister-in-law was sitting by my mother, and her hand, white and tightened around the glass of champagne she held, made me understand something was wrong. When I turned again, my mother was saying something, and Mira was replying to her, and with the shocked look on my mother's face, it was obvious that Mira said something rude. I excused myself quickly from the dance floor and walked up to them to find out what the argument was all about. I remember hearing the last part of Mira's words, and it really hurt me. She had said her brother was nothing like me, and she, my mother, should be grateful that Ricky married me, for I was a social freak. Those words, social freak, stuck with me even after she apologized for saying them. She hadn't meant to, but was pushed to defend her brother against the harsh words of my mother, something I never did and will forever regret. I wanted to prove to everyone that I could also socialize and be a fun girl. I wanted to do something crazy, have friends, and not only talk business all the time, so I did. I started partying with friends Anna and Marie, some girls I met who were also wealthy like I was. Back then, I thought they understood me because they had responsibilities like I did, but they deflected their responsibilities to other people to handle, and only did so little as sit through important meetings and sign documents and checkbooks. So they had enough time on their hands to have fun, and I did the same too, only going to the office if I couldn't get out of a meeting or to go sign documents. I was the little girl who hero worshipped her father and wanted to be just like him. I became so different, and even that affected my marriage. I was having less and less time for my husband. At first, he thought it was work keeping me busy until he heard me booking a spa for the entire day for my friends and me. He was surprised and asked about my friends, but I didn't want to tell him, so I ignored him that morning. Now, as I think back to that moment, I realize I was also insecure and jealous, and didn't want to introduce Ricky to my friends in case they noticed what I did and fell in love with him. My wealth started getting to my head, and I allowed it. The notion was I had money, I could spend it however I liked. When Ricky asked me about the sudden change I had, I told him I wanted to start living a little, that there was so much out there to be seen. The crazy thing is, whenever I had a party, I never went with Ricky, not just the fun parties that my friends had, but also any business party. Back then, I didn't want anyone asking him what he did, and realizing he earned less than I did. Back then, that fact became embarrassing for me. In fact, most people I worked with as clients or investors didn't even know I was married. The final and most major part of the problem started when Mom introduced me to Brandon. Brandon was one of her friend's sons, and my mom thought him a better choice for me than Ricky, so she made a good effort to bring him to my work that day. Meanwhile, Ricky had decided to surprise me with lunch because he knew how busy I could get and forget to eat. I was still savoring the meal he whipped up for me when my mom entered with this guy, whom I originally didn't know existed, and when she saw Ricky, she was visibly pissed. She, of course, hid it. I was the only one who could read my mother perfectly. She tended to hide her emotions underneath those layers of makeup, and somehow she had mastered the act of schooling her expressions to not show what she was feeling on the inside. This started after Dad died. So she introduced Brandon to me, and when I shook his hand and introduced myself, he didn't release my hand immediately and just raised it to his lips and kissed it, right in front of Ricky. It was when Ricky cleared his throat that I snapped out of it and removed my hand from his palm. When Brandon looked at me for an introduction of Ricky and I was going to say something, Mom beat me to it and said he was just an errand boy, probably there to give me food. I was shocked, though honestly, I didn't know what to say when Brandon asked for an introduction of Ricky because I was embarrassed. But I didn't intend to call him an errand boy. I just stood there looking between my mother and then Brandon. Ricky didn't say anything, just packed up the remaining dish he brought me and left. Mom was visibly satisfied when he left, and I glared at her, angry at her for embarrassing him that way, and at myself for not defending my husband. Brandon, well, started visiting me regularly. He would show up at work, in social gatherings that I went to, literally everywhere. I knew it was my mother's handiwork, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I liked him being around a little too much. Brandon was definitely a playboy. He was so smooth with words and got attention everywhere he went, and that was super easy given how handsome he looked. But what made me giddy was the fact that whenever he did turn up at places I was, he focused on me so much that it seemed like everyone else didn't exist. Truthfully, Brandon was my ideal type if I was asked what my ideal type was. He was rich. Well, certainly not as rich as I was, but he would probably be top 4 richest. He was handsome, a smooth talker, and knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't shy to go for it. At first, whenever he invited me to dinner dates or lunch, I refused. I wanted to respect what I had with Ricky. I mean, I did still love Ricky very much, but at that point, it felt like there were 2 different people inside of me. One that loved Ricky so much and didn't want to betray him, and the other that wanted to explore the chemistry she had with Brandon. So I started agreeing to dates with Brandon, and Brandon definitely made them exceptional. Sometimes a sudden trip to another country or state to have dinner or a tour in one museum or another. I never was one person interested in art before, but seeing Brandon's love for them and how he would say the history about each art piece we came across made me start studying them. He was just so tempting, and I guess I wasn't trying too hard to resist either. One time, Brandon had invited me to a party. It was his friend marking their 5th year of marriage anniversary, and it was a +1 party, so he had asked me to go with him. I had rejected at first because earlier that day, Ricky had asked me if I was free that night to go on a date, as it had been so long since we did. I was torn. It was either to hurt Brandon's feelings and go on a less fancy date with my husband, or it was to go to the party as Brandon's date and hurt my husband's feelings. I didn't want to hurt both men, but eventually I did hurt one, and it wasn't Brandon, it was my husband. I ordered a dress online, and it was delivered to me at the office, and it was absolutely stunning. I had ordered a matching bag and heels with the dress too, so I just styled my hair in my personal bathroom and applied lip gloss. I wasn't a fan of makeup, so the best I did was lip gloss. I hadn't even worn any makeup on my wedding day with Ricky. So I went with Brandon to the party. Everyone was gushing over my dress and how beautiful I looked. Brandon's friends were surprised he brought someone because he never did in the past. It made me feel so special that Brandon liked me that much to invite me to his friend's party. So when we had started dancing to the slow rhythm of the song, and Brandon had looked at me without blinking and had lowered his head for a kiss, I met him halfway. It was our first kiss, and it was explosive and just mind-blowing. It was nothing like Ricky's kisses. Ricky's kisses felt like home. It was safe and sweet and warm, and all the things coming home felt like. But Brandon's kisses were like a kid toying with all the buttons of a bomb about to go off. It was dangerous and flirty, a tease. After the party, I insisted he drop me off at the company. I didn't want to face Ricky, not with the way I was feeling. My feelings were all over the place, but one thing I recognized amidst them was guilt. I was cheating on my husband, and I didn't like that one bit, but my feelings for Brandon were growing by the minute, and I couldn't help myself. When I got home the next morning, Ricky didn't say anything to me, just left the house and went to work. It was when I was trying to walk by our mini table in the room that I noticed a ticket. Apparently, Ricky had booked a ticket to go to Paris for one evening and come back the next morning. I felt more guilty because I knew how much he must have spent only to waste it. He had probably chosen Paris because I had always talked about wanting to go not by myself, but with someone I loved, and that the evenings were the most beautiful times in the city. I felt really bad because, contrary to what he might have thought, I had spent the evening living like Paris in another man's arms. Right there, I knew I had to end whatever was going on with Brandon. I didn't want to hurt Ricky more than I already had. So I called Brandon and asked to meet, but Brandon said he was caught up with meetings and that we could only meet in the afternoon. So I waited for him to call me in the afternoon, but he didn't call. And in the evening, he sent me a text to apologize for missing the afternoon lunch he promised me, and that if I didn't mind, I could come over to his hotel where he was staying to have dinner with him so we could talk. I I shouldn't have gone, but I knew that I would probably lose my nerve to tell him I wanted to end things between us if I didn't go through with it that day. So I went to his hotel and was directed to his VIP suite. When I went in with the MasterCard that Brandon had instructed the receptionist to give me, Brandon was in the bathroom, and when I called him, he asked for a minute. By the time he came out, he only wrapped a towel around his waist, dangerously low enough to see the line of his hair disappearing into the towel. I had averted my eyes and reminded myself in my head that I came for a reason. Brandon asked that I sit while he got changed and ordered us dinner, but I refused and told him I had to tell him something urgently. He sat on the edge of his queen-sized bed, noticing my distress. I had then come out with the truth of my mom trying to force us to be together, when in fact I was actually married, and I didn't want to go on living that lie when I was still very much married. Brandon was shocked, and he just sat there staring at me for some minutes before he stood up and walked toward me and took my hand in his. He told me then he knew I was married because my mother eventually told him, but said how unhappy I was in the marriage, though I was too in love with my husband to end it. I wanted to correct him, believe me I did, because I was very much happy with Ricky, but Brandon stopped me and said he didn't mind that I was married, and he kissed me then. Well, we ended up having sex that evening. I know, I'm a terrible person, but in that position, what would you have done in that situation? Probably ran to the other side of the room and left, right? Well, I didn't do that, and I regret it now so much. From then on, I started having less and less time for Ricky. I was barely home because if I wasn't in Brandon's bed, I was with my friends at one party or another. They knew about my affair with Brandon, and they were super excited for me instead of discouraging me, saying how Brandon was more capable than Ricky could ever be, even if he worked hard for years. They spent time usually mocking Ricky and praising Brandon, and I allowed them. Sometimes, I would even join in the mocking, telling them how ridiculous our dates were like in the past. The day everything came crashing down was the day I went to a party organized by Marie. It started as a normal, usual day. I had left Brandon's place that morning, went to work, then later that evening headed to Marie's place for the party. We had been drinking, tipsy but not too drunk, and I had shown the girls the necklace Brandon had gifted me the night before, and they were screaming, excited for me. They started their usual teasing of how Ricky could definitely not afford it, and that he was definitely not up to Brandon, and how lucky I was to have met Brandon, and I had laughed, agreeing with them. After the whole party, I checked my phone for any important calls or texts, and I saw one from Ricky. It said, "We need to talk." I was surprised because I knew Ricky never sent such a plain and direct message to me before. He always ended with an "I love you" and lots of love emojis, which I had found cute before. I was bothered and changed my plans of retiring to Brandon's place that evening. I texted him that I had to go home, and he sent me a sad emoji. I went home, and when I got to our room, Ricky was sitting in the dark and holding a paper in his hand. To cut the whole long story short, apparently Ricky had shown up at the party, as I hadn't come home in the last few weeks, and he overheard me mocking him with my friends. When I came back home, there were divorce papers waiting for me to sign. How he got the divorce papers ready within 3 hours still baffles me. Perhaps he had been contemplating it a lot. Maybe it was enduring my mother's abuses or my family's mocking that had tipped him to the edge, or it was me never standing up for him, or maybe it was me ignoring and taking him for granted. But I guess the last straw was when he heard my friends comparing him to my lover, and me laughing and joking with them. At that moment, everything happened so fast. I was begging Ricky to forgive me, but he wouldn't listen, just packed his bags and left the house that night. I cried like I have never before in my life, and I wanted to get some sort of comfort. So that night around midnight, I went to Brandon's hotel room, and since I had a key with me, I didn't bother knocking, just opened the door and went in. I got the shock of my life when I saw Marie and Brandon lying naked on the same bed and sleeping soundly. They didn't even wake up when I knocked over the lamp in the room when my legs were too shaky to hold me still. I guessed from the champagne bottle lying carelessly on the floor that they were both very busy. I left and went back to my now empty house that had only my clothes and a few of Ricky's. It's been a few days now, and Ricky's brother, who apparently is a lawyer and was probably the one who prepared the divorce papers quickly, had been calling to remind me to sign the papers quickly. I didn't even know his brother was some hotshot lawyer because I hadn't been interested in my husband, and I regret everything now. I really love Ricky, and the thought of losing him completely is horrifying. Please, I need help in getting back my husband. Update. Hello, Reddit. I had come on this app to tell my story in hopes that perhaps I'll get some sort of ways or advice to win back Ricky, but so far, all I got were hateful comments. The comments made me feel even worse than I already feel. I realized I lost Ricky due to my own doing. I wasn't a wife to him. I didn't defend him. I didn't stand up for him. And instead, I just allowed him to face all the problems alone because he was always smiling, not knowing I was digging a bigger hole in his heart by pretending not to notice everything he was going through, all because he loved me. I even cheated on him with a total playboy. I've realized that I didn't exactly start cheating on him when I met Brandon, but long before that. I started cheating on him when I allowed my mother to have her way and also insult him every chance she got. I cheated on him when I refused to stand up for him or support his decisions to leave the house. I cheated on him when he was standing right there, and my mother called him an errand boy, and I couldn't even say anything. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible wife. When my mother heard of the divorce, she was happy that her plans had worked, and I was so angry that I lashed out at her and sent her and her stupid sisters and their kids out of the house. Yes, I did. I bought a small apartment that could only contain my mother and have never spoken to her since. Having to live alone in that big house all by myself felt like a punishment more than anything else, because my room was filled with everything Ricky's. The picture of him smiling adoringly, taken on our wedding day on the wall, taunted me every day because I had that, and I lost it due to my foolishness. He wouldn't even take my calls. I even went to see his mother, but the once loving mother who looked at me adoringly had changed and became so cold it was like she never knew me. It's certainly not her fault. I mean, who would blame a mother for wanting to protect her son from a devil like me? I feel so empty, and yet the emptiness is painful. I don't know how that's possible, but the emptiness is just so much more than I can bear. Update. Hello, Reddit. This is probably my last post here. I just wanted to tell you all that I finally signed the divorce papers after realizing there's nothing I could do to change Ricky's mind, and also because I realized too that it would be a sin to even ask for his forgiveness after everything I did to him. I'm very regretful, and I wish I had done things better. Learn from me, y'all. Goodbye, and thanks. From a terrible wife